Okay, so our attendees have started to come in and you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Shall we say, okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jing-Jing Lee, and I am the author of How We Disappeared. I'm here with Catherine Menon and Stephanie Scott today to talk about one of the many things our three novels have in common, the Asian women narrative. But first, a little bit about my co-panelists before I begin. Catherine Menon is Australian-British, has Malaysian heritage, and lives in London. Her debut novel, Fragile Monsters, was published by Viking in April 2021. She is a university lecturer in robotics and has both a PhD in pure mathematics and an MA in creative writing from City University, for which she has won the annual prize. Stephanie Scott is a Singaporean Indian and British writer and one of the Observer's 10 best debut novelists of 2020. What's Left of Me Is Yours is a New York Times editor's pick and was recently longlisted for the Jalak Prize Book of the Year, the CWA New Blood Dagger Award, and shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award.
Great, thank you, Jing. Jing-Jing Lee was born and raised in Singapore, and her first novel, How We Disappeared, was published by Oneworld in 2019. It has been longlisted for the Women's Prize, the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, and the Historical Writers Association Debut Crown. She has a master's in creative writing from the University of Oxford and currently lives in Amsterdam with her husband and son.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. Catherine and Jing and I, we're delighted to be here. If you could, we put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be opening the Q&A out to you guys towards the end of the session. And I think it would be great if we all began with an introduction to our novels, and then we can start to talk about female narratives and all of the similarities and differences between them. So my debut is What's Left of Me Is Yours. It's set in Japan and inspired by true crime murder, which occurred in Tokyo. So in Japan and actually in many other territories around the world, there are at-fault divorce systems. And within the Japanese at-fault divorce system, you can hire someone to seduce your spouse and provide you with grounds for divorce. And this is what sparked off the original ideas for my novel. So it's loosely inspired by a murder which took place when a husband hired a workplace surveyor, a marriage breakup agent, to seduce his wife. And my novel begins with a young woman called Sumiko, a newly trained lawyer who grows up never truly knowing how her mother died, until one day that changes. So it's very much a cross-genre novel. There's a murder, it's a story of mothers and daughters, but it's also a love story as well. And so that's What's Left of Me Is Yours. Catherine, your amazing debut, Fragile Monsters, has just been launched in hardback. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. So Fragile Monsters, which I'm sorry is backwards because my phone is apparently turning everything into a mirror image. But Fragile Monsters is the story of one family's experiences in World War II in Malaya, as it was then. So it traces their history throughout the build-up to the war, their experiences in the war, and of course the traumatic subsequent Malayan emergency. So Fragile Monsters discusses what happens when a granddaughter, Durga, visits her grandmother for Diwali and starts to probe a little bit more deeply into the family secrets that she's always taken for granted. She starts to uncover some things about her grandmother's life that she didn't necessarily know, and also starts to question what actually has happened to her mother, who's been absent for all of Durga's life. So Fragile Monsters is historical fiction, but just as with What's Left of Me Is Yours and How We Disappeared, it's also more than that. It's a love story, and it is very much a story of women. So Jing, can you tell us about How We Disappeared? Because again, women are taking such a central role in this?
Yeah. As with Catherine and Stephanie's book, I think How We Disappeared, it's also set in Asia, and it's the protagonist, the main character, is a 75-year-old lady, and How We Disappeared, the 75-year-old woman decides to face up to the ghosts of her wartime past, while Kevin, a 12-year-old, becomes the accidental recipient of his grandmother's deathbed confession. So in the converging of their paths, both Wang Di and Kevin uncover secrets that were never meant to be brought out into the light. You see that this cover here is very beautiful. It's also very Southeast Asian with the colors and traditional batik pattern that can be found in Indonesia and Bali. And also coincidentally, the red and white reflect the colors of the Singaporean flag. So, but very much a coincidence. Stephanie, shall we start with our discussion proper?
Sure, absolutely. So, so all of our novels center around women and particularly Asian women. And so I wanted to ask you guys, what were the initial challenges that you felt with choosing Asian female protagonists and then constructing them, particularly I think with the, I think as writers we're all very aware of the Western gaze, but also just of the global gaze and all of the stereotypes and I think assumptions that can come along with that. So I'm half Indian, half British, and my my mother once said to me, there's this perception that Asian women are just sex objects and dolls. And so how did you guys go about constructing your female protagonists, and how did you initially approach these stereotypes? Catherine?
Yes, shall I jump in? One of the things which I knew that I wanted to include, and I would be very interested to hear Jing's thoughts on this as well, is the question of age. So as you said, Stephanie, Asian women are usually seen through the lens of sex objects or young, pretty, submissive women, or alternatively as wizened, aged crones. Now, it was really important to me to construct an older woman, a grandmother, again, in fact, in her 70s, who didn't fall into one of those stereotypes, who had her own agenda, who had her own motives, her own desires, her own wants, and wasn't there solely to serve as a mystic advisor, as I think we see a lot of women in Asian narratives taking that role. She's much more of an active participant, as of course is Durga, who is, as was said in the Sunday Times, who is unlikable. And I took that as a compliment, because I think very often we tend to feel that we have to write likable Asian women. And of course, for you, Stephanie, Sumiko is not necessarily likable or constructed to be likable. So Jing, could you tell us a bit more? I would love to hear more about how you actually constructed your character, why you chose to begin with her as an older woman as well.
I'm afraid I didn't have much of a choice in that matter, because it just came, the character Wang Di came to me almost fully formed. And I think I've told Stephanie this as well, and several people, that she came to me quite formed, and I dreamt about her for a long time, and also while I was writing about her. And the thing that struck me was writing from her eyes was so easy, even though I had nothing in common with her, obviously because of her age and what she had gone through, also her social status, the fact that she was illiterate. So that wasn't like, I interestingly enough, I didn't have to expend a lot of energy trying to get under her skin. What frustrated me was the process of getting published. I think particularly because during the time that I was trying to get my novel out, the publishing was big on Asian rich narratives, and the whole thing about really sexy Asian women. And so there was a box, and the novel and Wang Di didn't fit into that box. So there was a hard time convincing people to buy into her narrative. And I guess because she also didn't have this whole I am woman, hear me roar thing. She is a victim. And I think I was trying to consciously reflect the plight of comfort women from Korea, from China as well. So by taking all that into light, she wasn't the most easy person to introduce into the world as a fresh Asian woman, and people weren't that willing to buy into this narrative, I think. So I guess that was a little bit tricky in only in that sense, because I had a really wonderful time writing her.
I agree with you, Jing, about the idea that there always has to be some sexual undercurrent to a story featuring an Asian woman. And Stephanie, you must have had to contend with this doubly, because of course your novel focuses on a situation that it would have been so easy to write as sexy Asian woman. So what were you thinking when you were trying to construct the novel and avoid that stereotype?
Well, with my two women, Sumiko, the young lawyer who's the protagonist, who's lost her mother and goes in search of the truth, she actually arrived fully formed too. I feel like she sat on my desk and had many opinions from the get-go. And my sort of personal, there are so many things that inform a novel, but my, obviously I'm not Japanese, but my personal experience of Japan has really existed throughout my life. My family's history with Japan started before I was born, in that my grandparents were in Malaya during the Japanese occupation. They were fluent in Japanese. And my English family also fought the Japanese in Burma. And, one side had long-standing ties with the Japanese. My Indian grandmother, who was fluent, became a lawyer and worked with Japanese clients for the rest of her life. My English side had very different reactions. So I had all these different views and perspectives on Japan before I even started researching this novel, and the novel itself took 10 years to research, where I did spend a great deal of time in Japan and won anthropological grants for my work there. But to answer your question, you're absolutely right. My women, Rina, the young mother we meet who's being entrapped by a worker associate, she's a young woman who's had to give up her life, her career in photography, her aspirations to become a traditional wife. And she's the opposite of sexy, really. I think when we meet her, she is depressed. She's in the midst of quite a severe depression. And, through Rina and also her daughter Sumiko 20 years later, I really wanted to look at how perspectives of women evolve, and also their position in society, that tension between societal expectation and personal desire, and who we're expected to be and the people we want to be. And there are so many, I think, stereotypes as well about women in Japan, from, kawaii, the cute, charming young girl, to the dutiful mother. I think very much, despite the equal opportunity laws that have been introduced, women are still very much expected to take over the domestic sphere and own it, whether they have jobs or not. And so that can be so restrictive and difficult. And I think there are so many, it's a very patriarchal society. And I thought it would be a great prism through which to view not only feminism in Japan as it's developing now and is quite exciting, particularly in the writings of Japanese female novelists, Miyake Kawakami, Sayaka Murata, for example. But also I wanted to broaden the conversation out more globally and to look at the universal themes, because I think the way in which women can be trapped and depicted and constrained is very universal. So that's really where I started with my women, almost writing against kawaii and expectations. Yeah.
One of the things which fascinates me about both of your novels, in fact, and which I know I had as an issue in the front of my mind when I was writing it, was the importance of family. So in Pan-Asian cultures, family is obviously a huge driver. Familial love, filial love, duty, obligation, they are all cultural tropes which exist very much in the real world, but which are represented in very different ways for individual families. So Jing, could you tell us a bit more about about the expectations of family that are in your novel, particularly around this issue of comfort women and the role that family played in perhaps integrating them back into a whole self after that trauma?
Yeah, I think one of the most tragic things about the whole issue of comfort women, I found out through my research, was the fact that a lot of these women did not feel comfortable going home. They felt ashamed. And quite a few of them who had been stationed in China, northern China and Mongolia, did not feel that they could go back home, to Korea mostly. And I think they did that out of a sense of, funnily enough, familial obligation, because they felt that by staying away, they would avoid tainting their family with the stigma of rape, of abduction. And it was, of course, many of these women were taken when they were really young, some as young as 14, 15, and they were still children, had been taken away. So many of these women wanted to go home, but they just felt that they couldn't. A part of the act of love, familial love, was them staying away. And that was intertwined with shame and the inability to talk about what they had gone through. And I think also, sadly, even more sad, was it was also out of knowledge, I think, quite real knowledge that going back home would have been really difficult. And sure enough, some people who did go back home, either they didn't talk about what had happened to them when they were in the rape camps, or they were totally shunned by their families and rejected when they did get home. Of course, some did go back home and then they restarted their lives by pretending that nothing had happened. And I kind of wanted this to be reflected in the book, because I wanted the knowledge of what had happened to be in the book. But what Wang Di went through there was, she went home and she was told by her family not to ever speak about what had happened, because they of course had an idea. Singapore is a very small country. It's an island, and like I say throughout my interviews, when people ask about research, whenever the subject of comfort women come up during research, people always make it a very clear point to say, this never happened to us, this happened to a distant neighbor, this happened to a distant cousin of a family friend. So it never touches them, it never can touch them, because the shame of this runs so deep. So in the idea of family love and duty, Wang Di had to wrestle with the idea of telling them everything, and also to protect her family, particularly her younger brother, from the horrors that she had seen. And this was something that her family could not give her. They couldn't give her the space to heal from her trauma. And I suspect that this was not uncommon, of course. I think Stephanie talked about how within the role of her family, Sumiko had these different faces. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what kinds of roles that she played in it and how much difficulty she had within those roles.
Yes, well, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned the Singaporean society, Jing, and how these things are always things that happen to someone else in a distant, unrelated way. I found the same, a similar thing actually with people's personal experiences of work sasaya or honey trapping or espionage or working with private detectives. People always ask me, whether I spoke to people who've been directly involved, and people are much more happy to talk about experiences that are not, theirs necessarily. And so I think one thing all of our novels do is focus on the reality of experience, and also the emotional reality and trauma of these experiences, and sort of bringing them into the light and having characters that own them, I think, are really important. So you're very right. My woman, Rena, grows up very much, she's very close to her father. It's a very loving relationship, but he's also a very dominant man with expectations. And when he dies, he raises Sumiko, and he does the best he can. But again, a lot of Sumiko's journey, like her mother's, is about finding herself and not only doing what Yoshi would want her to do or what society would want her to do, but what she wants to do. And they're both quite unusual women in that Sumi goes to Todai, which is one of the best universities in Japan. She gets in for law. Even today, that's quite unusual. I think only 1 in 5 students at Todai are women. And also there's a kind of stigma about women at Todai that they are unmarriageable and not sexy and completely unappealing and actually quite frightening. And I have several friends, female friends, who are lawyers who went to Todai. So that was very interesting to explore, again, the realities that exist. And for Sumi, really, I think her finding out what happened to her mother really enables her to look back on her life, and she has graduated in law, and to decide what she wants, what she personally truly wants, without any of the views of anyone else. And isn't that one of the central crises that we all go through one way or another? I think definitely as children of Asian parents, very firm ideas about what we should and should not do. Even my British father, who's British but has spent his whole life in Asia and speaks Asian languages. He's extremely Asian, at times more so than my mother. And he had very clear views about my career and life. So I think it's no coincidence that the novel focuses on those struggles for selfhood. And also duty, because I think it would be very easy to present these relationships as binary, as love-hate relationships, or relationships where the patriarchal figure has dominance. But what's much more interesting is to depict relationships that are complex and loving, where everyone really just wants to do their best, whether or not that is the case for the family members around them. I think that was much more real. And Yoshi, the grandfather in my novel, has the very best of intentions at all times, and he makes terrible mistakes, but he's not a villain, so I think it was also about looking at duty, responsibility that we all feel to each other, and trying not to demonize the characters, difficult as they may be. Catherine, what your novel is also very much focused on family and stories that are handed down, and duties and obligations. And you're wonderfully unlikable women. I must say, I like them very much. I think they're really interesting. But do you want to tell us a bit more about how your approach to family?
Yes, so again, as with both of your novels, family is central. In fact, the the only important relationships in Fragile Monsters are those of family, the sometimes adversarial relationship between Mary and her granddaughter Durga, as well as this curious absence, this lacuna where Francesca, the missing generation, is. And this was actually something that was born out of my research that identified exactly the same points that you've mentioned, Jing and Stephanie, which is this curious distancing. So for people who might just be tuning in, when you read a lot of accounts of Asia Pacific during the Second World War, there is very much a tendency in those accounts to certainly speak the emotional truth. The first person accounts aren't lying, they aren't misrepresenting, but they tend to distance trauma. So the specific traumas such as rape or such as families being torn apart tend to be retold as happening to the neighbor or the village next door, simply because it allows the speakers a certain modicum of control over their own lives. What you do get, though, which is very interesting, is a narrative with gaps in. You get a narrative where nobody will own those missing events, those missing traumas. And in my novel, the missing events are represented quite literally by the missing generation, by Francesca, Durga's mother, who is absent. She never appears in a defined form throughout the book. And of course, her absence is perhaps one of the things that's driven Durga's search for identity. I think, as you said, Stephanie, certainly with Asian parents, there's that really strong sense of duty. And I did find it interesting to read both of your bios and to compare where the personal and the fictional seem to mesh, because I know for me, certainly, Durga is a mathematician. She is both a firm proponent of logic. She works in a university, and at first glance, she could be read as me. I've certainly been asked, is this character you? Which seems to me perhaps to be somewhat missing the point. There are elements of me in Durga, just as I imagine, particularly for you, Stephanie, there are elements of you in both Sumiko and Rina, and for you, Jing. But these characters and ourselves, these characters, I think I speak for all of us, aren't based on our own personal experiences. This isn't narrative nonfiction in the guise of fiction. And I found it surprisingly important to draw that distinction in talking about Fragile Monsters. So particularly in discussing my two women who are at opposite ends of the spectrum. We have Durga, who is logical and extremely mathematically focused, and we have Mary, who is all about storytelling. So, as I said, a lot of people have tried to read me into the characters. And I think that's perhaps something that occurs to all authors, but I would venture perhaps occurs to female authors more. The realm of the female fiction has tended towards the confessional, has tended towards, as you put it, Stephanie, bleeding on the page, has tended towards intimate, truthful narratives, or fiction which is presented as them. And it can be quite difficult to convince people that this is not what, in fact, you're writing. So, Jing, I don't know if you have those feelings about how the personal and the fictional mesh in your novel as well.
I think Jing might be having some sound issues.
Oh, Stephanie, can I ask you then? Because I'm fascinated, because I know you've done this research in Japan. I know that to a certain extent, people are going to say, goodness, Stephanie, you're Sumiko. What do you tell them?
Well, of course, I think there are so many ideas and influences that feed into a novel, as you know. You don't need one idea, you need thousands to populate a book. And for me, definitely, you know, my Indian grandmother and I were extremely close. She was a lawyer. She managed to survive the occupation, the Japanese occupation of Singapore, and become the first female partner of the largest international firm in Singapore. And so it was always her dream for my mother and for me to become lawyers also. And there is no coincidence at all, actually, that Sumiko is a lawyer and that she's raised by Yoshi, who is a lawyer too. So there are a lot of elements from my personal background that feed into all of the characters, but they are nonetheless extremely fictional. I think that's the craft of it. And it surprised me a little bit when the book came out in hardback and I was being asked to do publicity pieces, because people sort of wanted to know elements that were autobiographical. And I mean, of course, Sumiko loses her mother, and my mother became extremely ill when I was writing this book, and we nearly lost her, and that caused me to really think very deeply about what my life would have been like had I not been blessed with her presence. You know, she's the most important person in my life. So there was a great deal of pain and emotional depth there, but I wouldn't necessarily have chosen to talk about it with relation to the book, because the book is a work of fiction. And so that's where I came up with the idea that in a lot of publicity, particularly for female authors, you can be asked to bleed onto the page. And I started to wonder if, you know, anyone had ever asked Ian McEwan to open a vein in the same way, because, you know, as you said, we've all done years of extensive research and we're writers, and this is a craft. And I think we all really worship at the altar of fiction. And so whatever your personal influence is, it's about creating a story and a work of fiction that resonates with as many people as you can find. So I think that was always at the heart of it for me. It's also why I didn't, you know, the novel's inspired by true crime, but it's not based on it. I didn't really want to be tied down by real events or to do some sort of non-fiction work. I think it's really important. I think fiction is a very powerful tool and it has a great role to play. And it's certainly, you know, one of the great passions for me. So that's why I was focusing on it. Jing, we're just welcome back. Are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
We're just talking about
technical issues. Despite my technical issues, I caught a bit of what you and Catherine were talking about. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I do understand the human need to link a written story to the author. And of course, I do that myself, and I want to know, does this have any relation to the author's life? But I often, after reading it, I just think this is either a great work of fiction or this feels like autofiction. But does it really matter in the sense of, is this a good piece of writing? And I wonder if people like to ask us that question, because it's a very human thing to be curious about the people that they're looking at. Yes. Like right in front of, whether in a book or the, you know, on the flap of the book inside where your picture is. I think it's a very human thing to feel the need to connect in any way they can. But the interesting thing about the book for me was I tried to distance myself from the book in whatever way I could, because obviously it's not a book that I took from my own life. I think the person I had most in common with could be, you know, at a stretch, Kevin, a 12-year-old, and that stretch is quite long. But I have to admit that
a bit of my family's life snuck into the book, but that's that's kind of the uncanny bit. It snuck into the book without me consciously writing it in, and no idea I was writing it in while I was doing so, and that kind of scared me. But I was writing what I thought was a fictional element, and it involved one of the characters' family being decimated during the war. And this actually happened to my paternal great-grandfather's family. And I had no idea during the time of writing. So I'd written that into the book. And then after reading, upon the first proof, I started to talk to my father about the war. We usually don't talk about the war, never talk about the war. And then he told me that this was kind of what had happened. So I think it is very difficult to keep oneself out of your book completely. You are the writer of your book. You have to be in it in some way, be it in like a tiny fraction of a character. Maybe it's in the way the character moves in the book or speaks, not directly from the author's own life, but there's always some element in there. Maybe the writer's mother is in there as a main character, something like that. So I think it's really, really hard to tear author and book apart from each other and say these two are distinct and separate and never twain shall meet. But I think this is good lead-in for the next topic that we have, which is how we have used history in fiction and how we have tried to recapture histories. And I think Catherine has done a really good job in capturing the really interesting part of Malaysia's history. So would Catherine like to start on this?
Yes, so thank you very much, Jing. One thing which I was adamant about was that although Fragile Monsters is a work of historical fiction, it is not the one story of Malaya during the war. So I again often find that people assume that there was one story of Malaya, one story of Singapore, perhaps for you, Stephanie, as well, one story about the Japanese divorce industry. Mm-hmm. And it makes no more sense than, for example, assuming that, Nick Hornby or Ian McEwan is telling the one quintessential English story. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was really important that the history was there, but that the history was a backdrop. So the importance of the novel is in the relationship between the characters. And I do think, particularly when we look at historical fiction, and specifically historical fiction pertaining to this time and region, we tend to be presented with a very, very high level, globalized, Eurocentric point of view. So stories about the Japanese occupation in both Malaysia and Singapore do tend to be subsumed into a wider narrative about Axis occupation, which I think does those stories a disservice, because obviously life in occupied Malaysia was very different to life in occupied France. It was, in fact, very different depending on your ethnicity. It was very different depending on whether you were experiencing it in the towns or in the countryside. So for me, it was really important to get the history right, but also to stamp on the history wherever it threatened to rear its ugly head, because we're people. We don't live history, we live our lives, and our lives are the really important thing about us, not whether or not we're living through the Second World War or a global pandemic. So for me, although it was incredibly important to get the accuracy correct, I have ended up with a whole load of research, a whole load of notebooks, far more material than ever made it into Fragile Monsters exists in my notebooks to give me color and context and emotional truth, but not necessarily to have fed directly into the novel itself. And I know, Stephanie, you've mentioned this before with yours as well. You did an enormous amount of research. You even have connection with a Japanese legal society, don't you, as a result of this? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I was actually made a member of the British Japanese Law Association as a result of my work. And I worked extensively with lawyers in Tokyo and prosecutors there, and also here at the Japanese Embassy in London. So there was a tremendous amount of work and effort actually that went into layering the legal sort of knowledge that I had acquired into the novel, but lightly, because you don't want it, obviously you don't want it to weigh down the scenes or the characters. And so I think this is something you do exceptionally well, Catherine, the way you convey all of the different races, the tensions, the different attitudes to each group and how they would be treated within the occupation. I just think you do this wonderfully with a very light touch. And I also aimed for that touch and spent a lot of time trying to achieve it. But also, I think for me, because my story is about a woman who was murdered, I think I really wanted to, as I said earlier, shine a light on the reality and also the horror of that crime. Because I think that, often the way these crimes are depicted in the news cycle, it can be rather dismissive. And I think people can become quite inured to these stories. And I wanted to really combat that. I think murder victims, victims of femicide, are silenced in the most brutal way possible. And they become defined by their deaths, defined by the crimes that ended their lives, and not by their lives themselves. And so even though this is fiction, I really wanted to bring an emphasis to the emotional reality of the lives that have been lived, of the people that existed, and of all of their hopes and dreams. And I think with Sumiko, when she's searching for the truth for what happened about her mother, she is in a way reclaiming her mother's history and her own, because she hasn't been told a great deal by her grandfather. I think that's a part of the book where she says, I lost my history twice, once by the legal system who denies her knowledge of it, and once by her grandfather who erased it from view. So she's really reclaiming both her and her mother's stories. And that was very important to me to focus on, because I think sadly, and probably even without intention, these cases can be dismissed quite easily and people turn the page. I didn't want to in that sense. Jing, what would you say about personal histories and personal practices?
I think, riffing off what you and Catherine said, it was of utmost importance to me to recapture what was not said. And because of the Eurocentric nature of the World War II narrative, a lot of people did not know that Singapore was of any importance at all during World War II. And nobody knew that there had been a kind of a genocide on the island, and that comfort women had been taken. They didn't even know of the horrendous term comfort women. So I kind of felt a duty to sort of, I didn't want to inform people per se in a real way, as if I were being didactic, but I did want to make this known. I did want to make this part of history known to people who would read the book. And often when I get messages from people, non-Asians, or even Japanese people who have read the book, they often tell me that this was something that they had not been taught in school and never come across, and nobody had told them about this. So they were really grateful for having stumbled across the book, and then therefore stumbling across this part of history that they would never have known about. And that is quite gratifying to read. Messages like that are really gratifying to read, because it means that I have done something to shine a little bit of light on what wouldn't have been seen. And I think Catherine and Steph, you did the same as well with your characters, with your very different narratives. And it's just something that if these books hadn't been published, I wonder which other books would have taken their place and reached the same kind of audience that we would have, reached. It's a nice thought to know that these stories have been represented in a certain way.
Yes, I wanted to say actually, just before we go to Q&A, Jing, that I'm so thrilled that you wrote How We Disappeared. I'm in awe of it, absolutely. Particularly having grown up with that history myself, and I've always wanted to see it in fiction, and you do it so beautifully. And you're right that nobody knows. Nobody's heard.
It really made me angry, actually.
Yeah, nobody has heard about how the Japanese cycled down through Malaysia. But just one note, when I met, there was a lawyer in Tokyo who I'm very close to, we're really good friends. But when I met her for the first time, I walked into her office, fully prepared to just talk about the judicial system in Japan. And she actually put her hands in front of her and bowed to me and said, "I'm so sorry for what my people did to yours during the Second World War." And it made me really tearful. And does even now, because it is so important. So thank you for writing your amazing novel. And I think we should now go to Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That was just such a entrancing conversation. I found myself getting thoroughly distracted from my technical hosting duties and just listening to you all. We have two questions. The first of which I think follows on really nicely from the discussion. It's from Carla Montemayor, and it is for Catherine and for Jing. How have your novels about World War II been received in Malaysia and Singapore today? I'm from the Philippines. My parents were kids during the war. Filipino comfort women came out in the 1990s, but very few people from their generation and my parents seem to want to listen to their stories. Should we go to you, Jing, first?
I think the reception by Singaporeans towards How We Disappeared was very positive from the public. It was reviewed in papers several times in different ways on the podcast, and everybody had amazing things to say about it. But I think they concentrated mostly on the narrative of the character herself, and there wasn't so much talk about, oh, this happened, and oh, we didn't know this, because everybody in Singapore has heard the story in one way or another, which is why I wanted to write it, because I was so familiar with this narrative, the narrative of the abducted women, and nobody was supposed to talk about her. And so in a sense, this is a very Singaporean novel, and people were I think the general sense was that people were really proud that a book like this had made it onto the world stage. And the reception from non-Singaporeans of Asian descent, they were, I think, I had quite a few people tell me that they hadn't known about this. So as I was saying, I was quite happy to therefore have written this book for also Asians who hadn't read the story when they were in school, or hadn't heard the story from their grandparents. And I think this is something that happened in the Philippines as well. And I wanted to reflect that in the book, but there was just no space to do it. I can't quite say for the rest, because I think it's quite across the board. It has been very positive, except for a few trolls from the far right in Japan. I got a few trolls who said that I was an agent of Korea and that this didn't happen. And it was all on Twitter, because, Twitter is where all the trolls hide, of course. I'm on Twitter too, so it's not judgment. It's just that it's very easy to hide on social media. Catherine, what kind of reception did you get for reflecting the history?
So it's a really good question, and thank you, Carla, because it's this question to a certain extent goes into the heart of what we need to do as authors to write for different audiences. So as Jing said, I've been lucky enough that people have very much liked it in Malaysia and Singapore. So people have been wonderfully kind in terms of engagement and reviews, which has meant a lot to me because it is the story of those people that I'm telling. One thing which has intrigued me, and which perhaps Carla you will be familiar with, is that the younger generation are incredibly keen to learn about this part of their nation's history. So to a certain extent, it still isn't being taught in school. Obviously, it is being written about in fiction, but it has been wonderful to have younger people say, you know what, I want to go and read some more about this. I think that's the best outcome. That's the best thing that someone could tell me that they've done after reading Fragile Monsters. So thank you for that question.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was an excellent question. We have one more, which is for everyone, which I think we will just have time for before we need to wrap up. And that is from Jessica Linfoot. And she asks, all of your novels deal with buried secrets coming out or being discovered by younger family members. Why and how did you choose which family members these are revealed to, such as Durga and Kevin, grandchildren, and Sumiko, daughter? Should we go to Stephanie first?
Sure. So how did I choose? I think they chose me, as Jing was saying. That Wang Di appeared to her fully formed. So did Sumiko, and she had such an extraordinary narrative drive of her own that there was really no choice but to follow her. And I think the rest of the characters developed around her very much. And I mean, of course, she grew the more everybody else grew. But I think it's quite wonderful when you're writing a novel and the voice finds you. I think all novels are different. They're quite like children, and they develop differently. And certainly, my second novel is much more shy and reticent, and there isn't a dominant narrative voice. So I think whenever a character does show up and they have force and direction, it's always such a pleasure to go with them. But I think I also wanted to have that cross-generational approach, so that one could look at the evolution of the law over several decades and how it has changed in response to people's needs, how it relates to law in other countries, also the socioeconomic developments in Japan that can mirror developments elsewhere. I really wanted that time frame to span that development and broaden it out to a more universal conversation. So yeah, that's why I made my choices.
And for me, again, it's a fascinating question. So thank you, Jessica, for asking it, because this goes to the heart of why we construct novels in the way we do. So not just the words, but the actual structure, the architecture and the scaffolding of them. So Stephanie's already said that to a certain extent, she has created these intergenerational representations for a logistical reason, so that she can show a first-person perspective of how the legal system has changed. And it was, to a certain extent, why I represented the characters in Fragile Monsters as a grandmother and her granddaughter, because it does neatly span the Second World War and the Malayan emergency. But perhaps more than that, I wanted to explore that slight sense of a missing stare that you get when the parent isn't there. So Durga, although she's grown up in a loving family, she's grown up without the security, without the anonymity of having the traditional family that most of her friends would have. She's grown up having to adjust to the ideas of a previous generation. And of course, that creates the potential for enormous conflict and trauma and difficulty in understanding. So it was a question which really intrigued me while I was writing the book. Which generation should I choose? So fantastic question. Thank you for asking it. And Jing, I'm curious what your answer is.
Yeah, I agree. That's a fantastic question. Because I think it brings to light the different characters that we have chosen for the novel and the different ways that we have written our books. And for me, as Steph said, I couldn't choose Kevin because he chose me. I tried to write his father into the role of the sub-protagonist, but that didn't work at all. So instead I replaced him with a 12-year-old, and it did fit. It fit. It just fit from the moment I decided that this was who I was going to write. And I think this also reflects the hopeful side. I think my novel, How to Disappear, is quite dark. It touches on wartime trauma, on rape. So it's a novel that is undoubtedly dark. And Kevin brings this new hope to the novel that there wouldn't have been. And it is with his voice, his new generational voice, that's so different from Monty's, that pushes the novel's narrative towards the future rather than linger in the past. And this is what I wanted to convey as well, because I think the generation of people are changing all the time, and stigmas are always being pushed aside, hopefully. And Kevin is one person who wanted to bring stuff out from the dark into the light. And I think that is in essence that captures the hopeful note in my novel. If there is a hopeful note, it would be Kevin and him and his tape recorder trying to capture the past and bring it into the present.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for your just wonderful conversations. So insightful. Do you have any last comments or anything you'd like to add before we finish up our session?
I just want to say thank you so much for doing, Catherine and Stephanie, for having this conversation with me, and thank you, Singapore Festival, for hosting us.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. It's really wonderful to have these platforms that fight the pandemic.
Yeah.
Still conversation. So thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you to everyone for coming as well. It's been a moment of connection.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you again to everyone who's come and watched this session. We'll be finishing up now, but make sure to have a look at some of the other events we have plenty on over the next couple of weeks. So, yep, keep your eyes open.